Sherlock Holmes and The Case of the Silver Mask, the Visitor in the Fog ****. It was in the bleak January of 1897, when London lay shivering beneath a mantle of damp mist, that the strange affair of the Silver Mask first intruded upon the quiet order of my life and drew Holmes once more into the circle of dreadful intrigue in which his peculiar genius so often revolved. I recall that evening with utmost clarity, for it began in an atmosphere so deceptively peaceful that one could scarcely have imagined the terrible events it would usher into our modest rooms at Baker Street. Holmes had been in one of his prolonged fits of abstraction, those curious mental retreats in which his body moved through the world while his mind pursued labyrinthine problems invisible to ordinary intellect. For 3 days he had spoken little, save to request additional tobacco or to mutter cryptic phrases into the coals. Even Mrs. Hudson trod more lightly than usual, as though fearful that any misplaced clatter might shatter the delicate equilibrium of his thoughts. I had resigned myself to an evening of quiet, my medical journals arranged neatly beside my chair and the fire burning low but comfortably. The rain had ceased an hour earlier, though the air carried the chill reminder of its passage, and the street below was muffled in a fog so dense that even the passing of a hansom cab became a ghostly whisper. I had just settled into my reading when Holmes suddenly straightened in his armchair with a violent start, much like a hound catching the distant scent of game. His eyes, sharp and bright, flicked toward the window. "You heard it, Watson?" I paused. I heard only the rainspouts emptying. Not the rainspouts. Footsteps. He tilted his head, listening with that extraordinary sensitivity which so often astonished me. A man, no, a woman. Light, hesitant. She pauses at the corner. Now she approaches. Note the uneven cadence? Fear, Watson. Fear makes the feet falter. I rose, about to draw the curtains, when Holmes gestured sharply for me to sit. "We must let her knock, if she intends to knock," he said, his fingers templed beneath his chin. "To do otherwise is to disturb the natural order of events." Ah, there it is. A soft rap sounded at the door, so tentative that it might easily have been mistaken for the settling of the house had Holmes not predicted it so precisely. Mrs. Hudson appeared a moment later. "A young lady for you, Mr. Holmes. She seems quite unwell." "Show her up," Holmes replied, his voice softening with a courtesy he reserved for only the most distressed of clients. The woman who entered a moment later was indeed a picture of anxiety. She was cloaked heavily, her veil drawn low, but even through the dim lamplight I discerned the pallor beneath it. Her gloves trembled as she clasped them to her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps, as though she had run a great distance or borne a terrible fright. Holmes stood, offering her his accustomed bow. "Pray be seated, madam. You are among friends here, and no harm shall befall you at Baker Street." At the reassurance, the woman collapsed into the chair opposite Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." Her voice was scarcely above a whisper. "I beg your help. I fear something dreadful is about to happen. It may already be happening." Holmes regarded her with polite attentiveness, though I could see the quick flame of curiosity already kindling behind his eyes. "Your name, madam?" She hesitated. "You may call me Mrs. Clara Ventham." Holmes' brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "May call you. Do I infer that Clara Ventham is not your legal name?" A tremor passed through her. I dare not say more than that, at present. Too many ears are listening in London these days, Mr. Holmes. Too many shadows seem to follow me." Holmes leaned back, studying her with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing his first incision. "And what, precisely, are you afraid of?" She drew a long, shuddering breath. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached into her reticule and produced an object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. "I received this 2 nights ago. No note. No explanation. Only this." Holmes nodded for her to place it upon the table. She did so with visible reluctance. Within the folds of the silk lay a mask, small, silver, exquisitely wrought, and of such polished craftsmanship that the firelight danced across its surface like water. It was fashioned to cover the upper half of a face, though curiously it had no apertures for the eyes. Instead, the eye regions were filled with thin sheets of some translucent material that shimmered faintly, neither glass nor crystal, but something more peculiar. I leaned forward, fascinated. "A masquerade mask." "No, Watson," Holmes murmured. "Not of any masquerade I have ever known." Clara Ventham shuddered visibly. "It came with nothing, no card, no message. But I know what it means. Or rather, what it must foretell. You believe it a threat? Holmes asked. I know it, she whispered, because this is not the first time the silver mask has appeared. 10 years ago, before I was married, there was a similar incident at my father's house. A man died, Mr. Holmes. Died wearing a mask just like this one. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Explain. I was 17 at the time, she said. A guest at our home, a distant cousin from the continent, was found lifeless in the garden. He had vanished during a gathering the night before, and when we found him at dawn, he was wearing a silver mask identical to this. The coroner could find no cause of death. A curious coincidence, Holmes murmured, though his expression suggested he considered it anything but. There is more, she said urgently. 3 days ago, a stranger approached me outside the Royal Opera House. He brushed past me and whispered only 2 words. It returns. And then he vanished into the crowd. Holmes steepled his fingers, his voice soft. And you believe the return of this mask heralds danger to yourself or someone close to you? I do not merely believe it, she cried. I feel it. My husband, Mr. Edward Bentham's missing. Holmes' eyes flicked upward. Missing? Yes. He departed for his club yesterday afternoon but never arrived there. Scotland Yard believes he simply slipped away on business. He is an investor in several ventures, but I know my husband. He would never leave without a word. And then, early this morning, I found another mask placed at our doorstep, identical to this one. Holmes exchanged a glance with me, a glance that spoke of the same chill that had begun creeping down my spine. Why come to me? He asked. What prompted you to break whatever secrecy you have maintained? She swallowed hard. Because this afternoon I received a third mask. She withdrew another silk-wrapped parcel from her bag. This one bore an inscription carved into the silver. Holmes unwrapped it with careful fingers. Upon the inner surface, etched with uncanny precision, were the words, "The final face awaits." Holmes' voice was low, almost reverent. Watson, the lamp, if you please. I brought it closer, and Holmes examined the masks as though each were a chapter in some hidden text only he could decipher. At length he spoke. Mrs. Bentham, you have done wisely to come. I cannot yet say what dark business you are entangled in, but I see enough to assure you that the threat is real. You must answer me truthfully now, even at risk of embarrassment or previous vows of secrecy. I will answer anything, she whispered. Holmes' gaze hardened with that steel-like intensity, which often heralded the beginning of his greatest investigations. Tell me, Mrs. Bentham, he said quietly, what do you know of the Society of the Veiled Eye? The woman's pupils dilated in terror, and her hand flew to her mouth. You do know the name, Holmes said grimly. Then the danger is far greater than I feared. She collapsed into sobs. And in that moment, in our small sitting room at Baker Street, with the fog battering weakly against the window panes and the silver masks gleaming like lifeless faces upon the table, I realized with dreadful certainty that Holmes and I were stepping once more into the shadows of a mystery as dark as any we had faced. A mystery that began with a whisper, a mask, and a name spoken only in fear. Holmes' method and the first glimpse of danger ****. The morning following Mrs. Bentham's distressing visit dawned pale and gray, with a mist that crept into every corner of Baker Street, curling along the floorboards and seeping beneath the doorframe like a living thing. Holmes had already begun his habitual peregrinations about the flat, his sharp eyes sweeping every surface with an intensity that would have seemed excessive to any observer unfamiliar with the subtleties of his mind. I watched him from the hearth, notebook in hand, prepared to record both his findings and his peculiarities. Watson, he said abruptly, breaking the silence, we are dealing with an adversary of intellect and precision. The masks themselves suggest craftsmanship beyond the ordinary. They are not merely ornamental. Notice the smoothness of the silver, the flawless etching of the inscription. Whoever fashioned them has the patience and skill of a master artisan and, I would wager, a mind inclined toward theatrics. I made a note, as always, and ventured. But Holmes, could it not simply be a cruel practical joke, someone attempting to frighten Mrs. Bentham? Holmes shook his head sharply. A prankster would not risk discovery, nor would he leave multiple artifacts across days. Observe, Watson. Each mask is placed deliberately. The first at her residence, the second at her doorstep, the third, as she claims, bearing a warning inscription. A prankster leaves one. One is sufficient. 3 are calculated. And do not overlook the timing each. Arrival seems synchronized with her husband's disappearance. The 2 events are intertwined. There is method in what she perceives as madness. I could not deny the logic in his assessment, though a chill passed through me at the notion. My physician's instincts rebelled against the creeping dread of violence suggested by the masks. Holmes' hand trembled slightly, not with fear, but with that peculiar excitement which I had grown to recognize as the precursor to action. He strode to the window and pushed aside the curtain, peering down into the foggy street. "The air is heavy today," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "There is a scent, Watson, faint but present a mixture of smoke and metal. Not unusual for London, yet here, close, yet elusive. It will lead us to the first clue if we observe carefully." I joined him at the window, following his gaze into the gray blur of the street. A hansom cab rattled past, and a distant bell tolled. "I confess, Holmes," I said, "your powers of observation strain credulity. I see nothing more than fog and gaslight." "Then, Watson, you have not looked with intent," he said, turning sharply to face me. "Observation is an art. It is more than vision, it is discernment. You must see with the mind as well as the eyes. If you notice, the mist is thicker on the right side of the street. That indicates either a recent disturbance of the air or a source of smoke nearby, likely a chimney of some covert establishment. And the faint tang of metal is not incidental. Someone is forging or has forged these masks close at hand. We have a starting point." I scribbled furiously, attempting to commit his deductions to memory. "Then you propose we search for this establishment, Holmes?" He smiled thinly. "Patience, Watson. There is no need to move blindly. The first step is to speak with Mrs. Bentham again, to trace the mask's journey, and, if possible, to examine the sites where they were discovered. She must not know how much we already suspect. Secrecy is essential. Fear is a dangerous companion. Often our adversaries rely upon it to cloud judgment." By mid-morning, we were at the Bentham residence, a modest yet elegant townhouse in the Bloomsbury district. The air was still damp and cold, and the fog clung to the cobblestones as though intent on hiding every detail from the curious eye. Mrs. Bentham greeted us with visible relief, her anxiety only slightly tempered by the presence of Holmes' cold assurance. Holmes wasted no time. He inspected each mask again, turning them in the light, examining minute scratches, the weight, and the faintly imperceptible markings along the edge of the silver. "Observe," he said, pointing with the tip of his finger, "tiny abrasions here and here. These marks suggest handling with care, but also movement through narrow spaces, perhaps a window or a grate. Whoever carried these masks is accustomed to stealth and precision. It is no amateur endeavor." Mrs. Bentham's hand shook as she poured tea. "But why my husband? Why us? He is not a man of great wealth, nor of public interest. There is no reason for him to be involved in anything dangerous." Holmes' gaze met hers with a piercing intensity. "Danger does not always seek the obvious, madam. Often, it selects its victims at random or, more accurately, according to a pattern invisible to the untrained eye. Mr. Bentham's disappearance is unlikely to be an accident. We must assume deliberate action until proven otherwise." He then requested that she recount every detail of her husband's last movements, every interaction, and every person he might have encountered. I observed her closely as she spoke. She was clearly truthful, yet I sensed a layer of fear she could not quite express, the unease of one who suspects that mere words are insufficient to convey imminent peril. Holmes took notes sparingly, relying more on mental cataloging than written record. When Mrs. Bentham had concluded, he asked for a detailed description of the locations where each mask had been found. The first had been delivered to the house's front hall, left on the doormat. The second had been found on the doorstep, where the fog had already obscured any footprints. The third, with its ominous inscription, had appeared atop a low garden wall. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "Notice, Watson, the progression is deliberate. Each mask moves closer to the household. Each placement increases psychological pressure. The final mask, containing the inscription, is symbolic, a warning that the next victim or the culmination awaits within the family's intimate space." Mrs. Bentham shivered. "It is terrifying," she whispered. "I cannot bear the thought of another mask arriving." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Precisely. Fear is both weapon and signal. Whoever orchestrates these events understands the human mind exquisitely. This is a craftsman of terror, Watson, not merely of silver. And note the masks are identical to those used in the previous incident of which Mrs. Bentham spoke. There is a historical continuity. This is no casual crime. It is a repeating pattern. I could only imagine the shadow that had fallen across the Ventham household, a family terrorized not by overt violence, but by the suggestion of it. Even as I observed, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, realizing that we had entered a game in which every subtlety might conceal mortal danger. Holmes stood abruptly. "We must examine the sites ourselves. No second-hand account can reveal the subtleties of spacing, ambient conditions, or minutiae of displacement. We leave at once." I hurried after him, and we ventured into the streets shrouded with mist, walking with the quiet diligence of those who seek secrets hidden in plain sight. As we approached the Ventham home for a closer inspection of the mask's placements, I could see Holmes' mind working like a finely tuned instrument, mapping possibilities, weighing probabilities, and ignoring none. It was then that a chill, more profound than the winter fog, took hold of me. I realized that the case, which had begun with a simple, silent mask, was far more complex and far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Holmes, however, walked ahead with his usual composure, untroubled by the storm of uncertainty that gnawed at my conscience. I knew, as I have often known in the years I have chronicled his adventures, that we were stepping into a mystery that would test both intellect and courage, and that, as ever, Holmes was already 3 steps ahead of whatever danger awaited. The first examination of the scene, the fog, clung to the streets of Bloomsbury with an almost palpable density when Holmes and I departed Baker Street, making our way toward the Ventham residence. My senses were alert, for there is an air about London in winter that seems to hold its own secrets: the smell of wet stone, the faint smoke of countless chimneys, the muffled clatter of boots upon cobblestones, all of it imbued with a certain quiet menace. Holmes, for his part, moved with the certainty of a man who discerns patterns in chaos. Each footstep, each tilt of his head, suggested a mind observing far more than the eye could detect. Upon arrival, Mrs. Ventham met us once again at the door, her pale face framed by the hood of her cloak. She seemed relieved, though her hands trembled with anxiety. "You are sure this is wise?" she asked. "To examine the masks myself. Do you not fear we may provoke the one who sent them?" Holmes regarded her with an expression that mingled gravity and mild reproach. "Madam, the truth must be approached directly. Fear, unexamined, will fester into panic. We seek not merely to understand the masks, but to trace the path by which they arrived here. Knowledge is our shield." He gestured for us to enter, and I followed him through the vestibule. The first mask had been placed upon the mat outside the hall door. Holmes crouched to examine the space closely, his eyes narrowing. "Note the disturbance of the dirt here," he said. "A boot print left by a man of small stature, heavily soled, and of a peculiar design. Observe the wear on the heel. The left shoe shows more abrasion, suggesting habitual leaning or imbalance. There is method even in this apparent carelessness." I bent closer, peering at the imprint. Indeed, the small variations in depth and angle were hardly perceptible, yet Holmes' keen observation revealed them as clearly as if they had been highlighted in chalk. "It seems almost impossible to detect without your guidance, Holmes," I murmured. "Quite so, Watson. That is why I am necessary. The eye untrained in minutiae sees but chaos. The trained eye sees narrative." We moved next to the site of the second mask, found on the doorstep. Holmes' inspection was more meticulous, the lens of his mind combing over every surface. The spacing of these masks, he observed, is designed to build psychological pressure. First at the threshold, then more intimate placement. The third, on the garden wall, is no accident. Its elevation demonstrates both the sender's audacity and intent to intimidate. Mrs. Ventham shivered. "I cannot imagine why anyone would do this. Who would gain from tormenting me and my husband?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he examined the garden wall carefully, noting the minute scratches on the stone where the mask had rested. "See here," he said, pointing to a faint gouge on the moss surface. "This is not the work of careless fingers. The mask was placed and removed deliberately, perhaps to avoid fingerprints, though the scraper marks betray haste or an unusual instrument. A specialized tool, no doubt, and one wielded with skill." He stood suddenly, and I followed his gaze to the surrounding garden. The shrubs, though unremarkable, were not without their significance. Watson marked the absence of footprints in the soil around this spot. The intruder approached from the west, where the mist is heaviest, placing the mask without disturbing the earth otherwise. Precision again, this is no ordinary criminal. Our adversary is careful, deliberate, and quite possibly obsessive in his methods. As Holmes spoke, a sense of foreboding deepened within me. The realization that we were not simply dealing with an erratic prankster but with a mind intent upon calculated intimidation was chilling. Yet Holmes' expression remained calm, his entire frame exuding that cool, analytical energy I had come to recognize as the precursor to discovery. Holmes next inspected the masks themselves with renewed attention, noting subtle differences I had previously overlooked. "Watson, observe the faint scratches along this edge. These are not accidental. They suggest repeated handling with a soft material, likely silk, which indicates care. Yet the inner surface shows slight discoloration, consistent with oxidation from human sweat. This mask was worn or at least touched by someone before delivery." Mrs. Bentham's eyes widened. "You mean someone wore it?" Holmes nodded slowly. "I do. Perhaps our adversary sought to imprint upon it the aura of human presence, to make it more sinister. Observe the translucency of the eye panels. One cannot see clearly through them, yet they suggest observation those who wear the mask may observe without being seen. It is a tool of terror, Watson, and its sophistication betrays the mind that crafted it." We then turned our attention to the broader context of the neighborhood. Holmes' gaze swept the mist-laden streets. This area is densely populated, yet the intruder navigated it without detection. Either a local resident, skilled in movement, or an individual possessing knowledge of the household's habits. We may deduce that he or she observed the family prior to execution of these acts, noting routines and vulnerabilities. I could not help but ask, "Do you suspect an outsider entirely, Holmes, or someone closer?" Holmes' eyes darkened. "A difficult question, Watson. Familiarity allows for subtlety, familiarity allows for distance, allows for audacity. Our intruder combines both qualities, or must possess exceptional daring. We shall discover which shortly. For now, we must examine one more thing: the tools of the crime." Holmes carefully turned the masks over, inspecting their inner surfaces with his magnifying lens. He paused, then tapped each one gently with his fingernail. The sound was metallic, precise, and slightly hollow. "There is a subtle difference in the tonal quality between masks," he murmured. "Each mask may have been produced separately, or finished by the same hand with slight variation in technique. This detail suggests a workshop, a private location. We may need to investigate local craftsmen who work in silver with secrecy and discretion." I observed the garden wall and doorway once more. "Holmes, do you believe the intruder may strike again?" Holmes considered. "The pattern suggests escalation. We have 3 masks. Initial warning, psychological pressure, and now explicit threat. If we are correct, further action will be necessary to achieve the ultimate goal, whatever that may be. We must prepare, and we must anticipate." At that moment, a faint sound drifted through the fog, a distant footfall, light and hurried. Holmes' head snapped toward the direction of the sound, eyes narrowing. "Do you hear it, Watson?" The footsteps again. Not our adversary, perhaps, but an observer. London streets are never silent, yet this presence is deliberate. I strained my ears but detected only the vague echoes of the city, the muted clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the occasional bark of a dog, and the hiss of the fog against gas lamps. Holmes, however, was already moving, cautious and deliberate. "Come," he said. "The game has begun in earnest, and every moment we delay grants our opponent the advantage. Mrs. Bentham, remain indoors and take every precaution. Should anyone approach, you will not respond. Understand?" She nodded, trembling, yet with a spark of resolve now apparent. Holmes' sharp command seemed to imbue her with a sense of purpose. As we departed into the mist once more, I could not suppress the uneasy thought that this case was unlike any we had previously encountered. The combination of psychological terror, precision craftsmanship, and the shadowy hand-guiding events suggested a mind both brilliant and perilous. I followed Holmes through the foggy streets, feeling, with each step, the invisible web of intrigue stretching out before us. By the time we returned to Baker Street that evening, the first impressions of the scene had already taken root in Holmes' extraordinary mind. I noted, with a mix of admiration and trepidation, that he was piecing together a map of deduction invisible to all but himself. The masks, the placements, the fog-shrouded streets, all were now parts of a puzzle that promised revelation, though as yet the solution lay tantalizingly beyond our grasp. And so I retired that night to my chambers, troubled by thoughts of the silver masks and the unknown hand that wielded them. I felt the weight of anticipation pressing upon me, for I knew that in the days to come, the shadows would deepen, the threat would grow, and the mind of Sherlock Holmes would be tested in ways that promised danger, discovery, and the unveiling of secrets hidden in plain sight. The first suspect emerges ***. The morning after our detailed survey of the Ventham residence began with a gray drizzle, which seemed to linger in the streets like the pall of some silent and unseen menace. Holmes had already been awake for hours, according to Mrs. Hudson, and I found him at breakfast, poring over a pile of London directories and almanacs, his long fingers drumming impatiently on the table. "Watson," he said without looking up, "I have considered our adversary's method of approach. There are few individuals in this city capable of executing such precise acts, both in timing and in craft. We need a profile before we proceed with interviews. The masks themselves tell us much about the character of the culprit." I poured the tea, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. "And what, pray, does the mask tell us, Holmes?" "Everything and nothing," he replied, setting down a mask that he had brought with him in a small case. "Observe its weight, its smoothness, the slight oxidation upon the inner surface. Its design is elegant yet utilitarian. The work of an artisan, yes, but not merely that. There is purpose behind its creation. Observe the curvature here." Watson noticed the subtle asymmetry, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. "The asymmetry accommodates human idiosyncrasy. The maker understands human behavior. This is the work of someone who is both meticulous and imaginative. Perhaps a craftsman, perhaps an actor, perhaps both." I nodded, recording every detail. I could see in Holmes' eyes the glimmer of excitement that always heralded a new case. There was danger here, certainly, but also the promise of intellectual challenge. It was just as Holmes predicted. The first lead arrived not long after our breakfast. A telegram, delivered with unusual haste, bore the return address of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Its contents were brief. "Mr. Holmes, urgent consultation requested. There is a man of interest in the Ventham case. He was seen near the Opera House on the night of the third mask delivery. Name, Mr. Percival Grimshaw, jeweler. Present at Yard 10 a.m. today. Lestrade." Holmes' eyes gleamed with anticipation. Percival Grimshaw, a jeweler of some repute, a craftsman in precious metals, not unlike the creator of our masks. "Watson, we shall attend at once." By 10 o'clock, we were at Scotland Yard, the hallways damp and smelling faintly of ink and unwashed coats. Lestrade, stout and slightly disheveled, met us with a mixture of relief and exasperation. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said. "Thank heaven you're here. Grimshaw is a slippery fellow, but I believe we have him cornered. He was seen loitering near the Royal Opera House. Witnesses place him there the evening the last mask appeared." Holmes inclined his head. "Thank you, Inspector." "And his profession, you say?" "Jeweler. Known for silver work. Elegant, precise like our masks. He has, on occasion, been involved in small disputes over missing goods, though nothing serious. He is clever and cautious. The witnesses believe he has some connection with the Venthams, though none can say how direct." Holmes nodded, steepling his fingers. "We must speak with him directly." Grimshaw was brought into a small interview room, where the fog from the street seemed to leak beneath the door, lending the proceedings a faintly spectral quality. He was a man of medium height, well-dressed, but his manner betrayed slight tension, an eagerness to appear calm while concealing agitation. His hair was dark, his eyes restless. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Grimshaw, I believe you are acquainted with Mrs. Clara Ventham?" Grimshaw's eyes flicked toward Lestrade and then to Holmes. I know the name, sir. But only in passing. My business dealings are wide, and we have many clients in that quarter." Holmes' lips curved slightly. "Indeed. And yet it is said that you were observed loitering near the Royal Opera House the night the third mask was delivered. Could you account for your movements?" Grimshaw hesitated. "You're attended to a shipment of silver there, yes. Some pieces were sent to a patron. I had nothing to do with the Venthams personally. I assure you I have no connection to this matter." Holmes regarded him with a quiet, almost imperceptible intensity. "You claim no connection. And yet, Mr. Grimshaw, you are a jeweler, a maker of silver, and these masks, which have been placed in 3 locations significant to the Ventham household, are crafted in the most delicate silver, with techniques only a master could employ. I suggest that your familiarity with silver work may have played some role in their creation." Grimshaw's face paled. "I do not know what you mean." I have been making silver for years, yes, but I have no involvement in silence, if you please, Holmes interrupted, holding up a hand. Your agitation betrays knowledge of the masks, though you deny it. Do you wish to confess, Mr. Grimshaw? The man shook his head vehemently. No. I am innocent. I swear it. Holmes' expression softened just slightly as he leaned back in his chair. Innocent men rarely tremble when confronted with the facts of their lives, Mr. Grimshaw. Yet there are ways to prove innocence beyond the mere denials of the lips. Tell me, were you anywhere near the Ventham residence at the times the masks were delivered? I know. Grimshaw insisted, though the tremor in his voice betrayed hesitation. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Then let us test that statement, shall we? Inspector, you may call for the witnesses who observed his movements that evening. A clerk entered and Lestrade gave instructions. Soon, a young woman who claimed to have seen Grimshaw near the Opera House was brought in. She confirmed his presence, describing his movements and noting that he had been cautious, glancing about frequently, yet had not entered any building publicly. Holmes listened, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. And yet, he said softly, she observed him only in the foggy streets. Not inside the Opera House, not at the Ventham residence. His presence in the area is undeniable, yet it is circumstantial. Circumstantial, Watson, and thus insufficient to convict. Grimshaw sagged slightly, relief mingling with lingering fear. Then you do not suspect me? Holmes' lips curved in a faint sardonic smile. Not as yet. But you are a man of skill in silver, and skill may be both gift and temptation. Keep close to your conscience, Mr. Grimshaw. The next time you handle a mask or any silver you may wish to remember that it could betray you. The man nodded, visibly shaken, and was allowed to depart under Lestrade's supervision. Holmes turned to me as the door closed behind Grimshaw. Watson, take note. Grimshaw is a convenient suspect. He possesses the skill, and he was present in the vicinity. The police will seize upon him as the likely culprit. Yet I am far from convinced. There are inconsistencies here, small, subtle, but sufficient to suggest our adversary is more cunning than a simple artisan. The first suspect is rarely the true architect of a scheme as intricate as this. I could not help but admire Holmes' insight, though I felt a lingering unease. The masks were not merely ornaments, they were harbingers of something darker, and the shadow of the real villain, yet unseen, seemed to stretch across London itself. Holmes rose, collecting his hat and coat. We must continue our investigation, Watson. Grimshaw is but a distraction, a piece of misdirection. The truth lies elsewhere, and I intend to find it before the masks deliver their final message. As we stepped into the mist-laden streets once more, I realized that the case was entering a new phase. The first suspect had appeared, yet the threads of deception, subtle and deliberate, had only begun to unravel. I could sense, with a foreboding certainty, that the true adversary was watching, calculating, and preparing for the next move, and that we were still several steps behind in a game that promised danger at every turn. The hidden clue **** the afternoon following our encounter with Mr. Percival Grimshaw was grey and oppressive, as though the London fog itself had thickened in anticipation of yet more sinister revelations. Holmes, as always, had risen early, pacing the flat with a restless intensity, his eyes scanning each object in Baker Street as though they might whisper their secrets if only he listened closely enough. I observed him quietly from my chair, attempting to chronicle the events that had unfolded without the disorder of conjecture overtaking the facts. Watson, he said suddenly, without preamble, Grimshaw is a convenient suspect. That much is certain. Scotland Yard will latch upon him as the architect of this affair. Yet observe the details, the minute subtleties we find contradictions. I rose, curious. Contradictions. Where, Holmes? Everything seemed to point toward Grimshaw. Holmes shook his head. Seemed, yes. But appearances are often misleading, especially in matters designed to terrify and misdirect. Let us review the sequence. The first mask at the Ventham doorstep, the second upon the mat, the third upon the garden wall. Each delivery method is precise, deliberate, yet the timing, Watson, is most peculiar. Observe. The first mask arrived on a day when Grimshaw was confirmed to be in his workshop until evening. The second mask, however, appeared within a brief interval when the streets were obscured by fog, yet eyewitnesses place Grimshaw near the Opera House only in passing. The final mask is delivered in a manner inconsistent with his known habits and schedules. I furrowed my brow. Then you do not believe him responsible? Holmes gave a faint, sardonic smile. "I never believe the obvious suspect in the first instance, Watson. To do so is the mark of an ordinary detective, content to solve only half the puzzle. Our adversary, however, is precise, patient, and calculating. Grimshaw is a red herring designed, perhaps even intentionally, to draw attention." Holmes' fingers drummed against his knee as he contemplated the case. "Yet there is a clue we have overlooked. Something so subtle, so easily dismissed, that it is invisible to the untrained eye. We must return to the Ventham residence and examine the third mask anew." We departed almost immediately, the streets of Bloomsbury still draped in a heavy fog. I noticed with a growing sense of unease the way Holmes' eyes flicked to the shadows, as though he expected them to shift and reveal hidden figures at any moment. Upon arrival, Holmes requested that Mrs. Ventham show us the garden once more. The final mask, resting atop the low stone wall, had been removed for safekeeping, and she handed it to Holmes with a reverent tremor. He examined it in the dim light of the drawing room, turning it slowly, weighing its balance, noting the faintest marks upon the silver. "Watson, observe this," he said, pointing to the inner rim. There were two small punctures, barely perceptible, near the edge where the mask would rest against the face. Tiny, almost imperceptible holes, made with a very fine awl or pin. Someone inserted these with a purpose, perhaps to attach a strap or ribbon, perhaps for more sinister intentions. Yet note the position. Slightly off-center, designed to avoid detection but still functional. "This is a signature of the maker." Mrs. Ventham gasped. "A signature? You mean the same person made all three masks?" Holmes nodded, his fingers tracing the faint scratches along the surface. "Precisely. Grimshaw may have the skill to craft silver, but his known methods differ from this. These marks betray another hand entirely, one unfamiliar with ordinary commercial silverwork, yet familiar with the human face. It is a personal, intimate knowledge, Watson, of anatomy and craft combined." I was struck by the subtlety of the observation. "Then our true adversary is someone we have not yet considered?" "Exactly, Watson, and there is more." Holmes leaned back, allowing the mask to rest gently in his hands. "Observe the faint discoloration here, along the left cheek. Not tarnish, not accidental human sweat. The mask was worn, yes, but not by Grimshaw. By a woman." I blinked. "A woman? That changes everything." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Indeed. The fear, the timing, the precision all now suggest a perpetrator who understands not only the Ventham household, but the psychology of women intimately. Grimshaw is, at best, an auxiliary figure, a decoy. Our adversary orchestrates events with psychological insight, perhaps anticipating the very reactions we have observed. Fear, consultation with detectives, reliance on men of skill to serve as scapegoats." Mrs. Ventham, who had been standing silently, suddenly spoke. "But Holmes, who could it be? Someone known to us? Or a stranger?" Holmes remained silent, his gaze intent upon the mask. "I cannot say at present. The evidence is insufficient to assign a name. Yet the manner of delivery, the precision of craft, and the subtle signs of personal knowledge allow me to make one deduction. This person has observed the household for some time, perhaps months, perhaps years. The mask is a warning, yes, but it is also a message, a demonstration of power." He rose abruptly. "Watson, we shall need to inspect the manner of delivery, the access points to the house, and the likely routes by which these masks were conveyed. And yet, we must exercise discretion. The adversary is clever and cautious. If we act openly, we risk detection and escalation." I felt a shiver as I considered the implication. "You mean we are being watched?" Holmes' smile was thin, almost sardonic. "Quite likely, Watson. That is why observation is essential. And that, in turn, is why subtlety is our greatest ally. One misstep, one hasty assumption, and we may provide our adversary with exactly what he or she desires: fear and confusion." We spent the next several hours retracing the path of the masks, examining the street outside the Ventham house, the garden wall, the mat, and the surrounding air for signs overlooked by ordinary observation. Holmes noted every detail: the slight abrasion of the mat, their faint displacement of moss on the wall, the absence of footprints in the damp soil, recording mentally what I would have missed entirely. At length, he turned to me, expression unusually grave. "Watson, there is a hidden clue here, subtle yet decisive. I shall not reveal it, yet its significance must be weighed against subsequent events. Patience is critical. Often, The hidden element reveals itself only when combined with the motions of our adversary. Yet mark my words, it is present, and once recognized, it will point us directly to the architect of this terror. I felt both frustration and awe. Holmes had already perceived something beyond my understanding, a detail so subtle that I could not even speculate upon it. And yet, I trusted him utterly, knowing that his deductions, however mysterious at the outset, would eventually converge with clarity and certainty. As we left the Ventham residence that evening, the fog had grown denser, curling around lampposts, winding through alleyways, and transforming the familiar streets of Bloomsbury into a labyrinth of uncertainty. I sensed, as I often did in Holmes' company, that we were being drawn deeper into a web of intrigue, the threads of which stretched in directions I could not yet foresee. Holmes, for his part, moved with his customary composure, his gaze fixed upon some distant, imperceptible pattern. I followed, aware that the game had shifted. Grimshaw had been identified and dismissed, yet the true adversary remained hidden. And somewhere in the fog, the next mask or the next message awaited, ready to reveal its significance to those perceptive enough to discern it. The hidden clue was there, subtle and elusive, waiting to be unearthed, and I had every confidence that Holmes, in his relentless pursuit of truth, would uncover it when the moment was ripe, revealing the first thread of a complex tapestry whose design was only beginning to emerge. The shadow of escalation **** the morning following our painstaking examination of the Ventham masks dawned with a grim pallor, the sort of London day that seeps cold and damp into one's very bones. Holmes had scarcely slept, I gathered, for when I joined him in the sitting room, he was already pacing, his gaze fixed upon the gaslight as though it might yield some new insight if examined closely enough. "Watson," he said abruptly, without turning, "the pattern is becoming clearer, yet more troubling. The initial warnings have evolved into threats, and the timing of each delivery is precise. We may reasonably anticipate that the next incident will be more direct. We must remain vigilant." I had barely settled into my chair when a hurried knock resounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson, her eyes wide with concern, admitted a young messenger, damp from the fog. He thrust a telegram into Holmes' hand before vanishing as swiftly as he had arrived. Holmes broke the seal and scanned the contents with rapid, flickering eyes. "Indeed," he muttered, "as expected. The game has escalated." I leaned forward, eager yet apprehensive. "Holmes, what is it?" He handed the telegram to me, though his expression remained unreadable. The message, brief and formal, read, "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes, there has been a break-in at the Ventham residence. Nothing stolen, but disturbances noted in the drawing-room and garden. Mrs. Ventham uninjured but shaken. Immediate attention requested. Inspector Lestrade." Holmes' jaw tightened. "Observe, Watson. Our adversary has moved from psychological intimidation to physical intrusion. Yet note the care. No theft, no obvious violence. This is a message, not a robbery. And the signature style the masks. The precise disturbance remains consistent. The same mind is at work." We departed immediately, the fog now rolling thicker along the streets of Bloomsbury, reducing every gas lamp to a dim halo. The chill that pressed against my coat was nothing compared to the apprehension that gripped my heart as we approached the Ventham house. Mrs. Ventham met us at the door, her face pale, her hands shaking. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said breathlessly. It's worse than before. Whoever did this, they were inside my home." Holmes inclined his head. "Tell me exactly what you observed, madam." She led us into the drawing-room, where evidence of intrusion was immediately apparent. The cushions on the settee were disturbed, though nothing was missing. A vase on the mantel had been shifted, yet remained unbroken. The faint indentation of footprints could be discerned in the rug, though the damp fog outside had left the prints nearly imperceptible. "They left no mask this time," Mrs. Ventham said. "But I found this." She extended her hand, revealing a small folded scrap of paper. On it was a single sentence, scrawled in delicate, precise script. "The final face is nearer than you think." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "A further psychological escalation, Watson. The intruder has advanced from placement of objects to direct intrusion, yet still refrains from confrontation. The message is clear, observation is ongoing, and the threat is immediate." I felt a shiver creep along my spine. But Holmes, how could anyone enter unnoticed? The house is not easily accessed. Surely the intruder had knowledge of the layout. "Exactly, Watson. The intruder possesses familiarity. Observe the absence of forced entry. No broken locks, no smashed panes. Someone with intimate knowledge or the means to bypass ordinary security measures entered and departed undetected. This is no common criminal. Holmes' eyes swept the room, resting briefly on the fireplace, the curtains, and the faint marks on the rug. He crouched to examine the footprints more closely, and I followed, striving to capture every nuance. "Note the spacing, Watson," he murmured. "The steps are deliberate, cautious. The intruder moves with intent, yet leaves markers perhaps to measure space or confirm placement. Observe the left shoe more worn on the sole, suggesting habitual posture.
Subtle, yet revealing."
Mrs. Ventham wrung her hands. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, must we live in fear of this shadow?" Holmes' expression softened for a moment. "Madam, fear is precisely what our adversary seeks. But knowledge tempers fear. We shall discover the identity of this shadow, and the threat will be neutralized." He motioned toward the garden. "Watson, the intruder left more than impressions indoors. Note the mossed wall. The disturbance is faint, almost imperceptible, yet present. Our adversary scaled no more than 3 feet, carefully, without damaging the stone. The same technique as before, with the masks. Observe the precision, Watson, the same hand, the same discipline, the same familiarity with subtle mechanics." I shivered. It is unnerving, Holmes, to see how methodical, how careful this person is. Holmes nodded. "Exactly. We are dealing with intellect and patience combined. Observe also the psychological pattern. The initial masks, the progressive intimidation, the intrusion, all designed to gauge reaction. Our adversary wishes to measure fear and uncertainty. Every detail is orchestrated." I glanced around the room, noting the meticulousness of the disturbance. "Do you think this person might strike again tonight?" Holmes' gaze was distant. "It is a strong probability, Watson. Escalation seldom ceases voluntarily. And yet, the intruder's next move may reveal much, particularly in conjunction with the hidden clue we have identified in the masks. Patience, observation, and readiness are our allies. We must remain vigilant, without overexerting ourselves." Inspector Lestrade arrived soon afterward, bringing his customary mix of exasperation and respect. He had already gathered statements from the household staff and canvassed the immediate neighborhood, yet his findings were sparse. "No one saw anything, Holmes," he admitted. "No footprints beyond those in the drawing room. Fog thick as soup outside. Anyone could have come or gone unseen. The scoundrel is cleverer than the lot of us combined." Holmes inclined his head. "Cleverness, Inspector, is insufficient. Knowledge, patience, and method are essential. We shall examine the points of access, the patterns, and the movements, and, in time, the perpetrator's identity shall become clear." He lingered for a moment near the garden wall, examining the faint abrasions on the mossed surface. "Watson, note the absence of debris on the pathway. The intruder departed with care, yet the subtle signs remain. A scratch here, a slight displacement there. It is all deliberate. Every gesture is a test, a message, a signature. Observe how the intruder escalates the psychological tension while avoiding immediate detection. This is the hallmark of intellect and daring combined." The remainder of the day passed with careful inspection. Holmes scrutinized each angle, each footprint, and each object that had been moved. Mrs. Ventham, though frightened, observed with a mixture of hope and trepidation, realizing that the mind she had engaged, the mind of Sherlock Holmes, was at work, unraveling the invisible threads of her torment. As we finally departed for Baker Street that evening, I felt the full weight of the situation. The first masks had been delivered. The first suspect, Grimshaw, had proven a distraction, and now a second, more alarming incident had occurred. The intruder was escalating, testing our reactions, probing for weaknesses, and leaving subtle clues of methodical terror in every corner. Holmes walked beside me through the misty streets, eyes scanning shadows with his habitual intensity. "Watson," he said at last, "the case is no longer merely a puzzle of objects and letters. It has become a study in psychology, in patience, and in subtle signaling. Each incident, each mask, each intruder movement is a statement. The adversary's intent is clear: to dominate, to intimidate, and to manipulate. We must remain 3 steps ahead, or the next step may prove disastrous." I shivered as the fog swallowed us, realizing with a growing unease that the true danger was yet to reveal itself, and that the next incident might be far graver than all that had preceded it. Misdirection and the shadow of deception asterisk. The fog that shrouded London that evening seemed almost sentient, curling through the alleys, wrapping gas lamps in halos of diffuse light, and muffling the usual clatter of carriage wheels upon the wet cobblestones. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street after our inspection of the Ventham residence, both of us weighed down by the gravity of the escalating case. Yet, in Holmes' demeanor there was that familiar glimmer, calm, analytical, and quietly assured. "Watson," he said as we entered the flat, "the intruder's methods are becoming clearer, and yet, paradoxically, more elusive. The psychological escalation is deliberate. Our adversary wishes to mislead, to confound, and to manipulate both the household and ourselves." I sank into my chair, fatigued yet restless. "Holmes, do you believe the intruder intends to strike again soon? After the break-in today, surely Mrs. Ventham's household is alert?" Holmes poured himself a cup of tea, his eyes narrowed in thought. "Yes, Watson, and that is precisely the point. Each prior act was carefully calculated to provoke a reaction. Observe. The first mask a warning, the second psychological pressure, the third direct intrusion. Each step tests the household and measures our responses. And now, we must consider misdirection. Grimshaw, the jeweler, was the most obvious candidate, yet his guilt is improbable. That is exactly the trap laid for Scotland Yard. The path of least resistance is rarely the correct one." I nodded, understanding Holmes' reasoning, but also feeling the disquiet of knowing that the true adversary remained unseen. The following morning brought us an opportunity, though it was one wrought with ambiguity. Lestrade had secured information from a local pawnbroker who reported that a man matching Grimshaw's description had attempted to sell a set of silver pins in the past week, pins with a peculiar engraving, described by the broker as similar to the fine craftsmanship of the masks. Holmes' eyes lit at the report. "Indeed, Watson, this is exactly the sort of apparent connection Scotland Yard might seize upon." Yet, notice the timing. The pins were offered the day before the first mask arrived. If our adversary were Grimshaw, would he not have delivered the masks first, and only then sought profit? The sequence is incongruous. I frowned. Then this report is a distraction. Holmes' expression was a faint smile. "Exactly. Misleading evidence is a classic technique. The intruder or perhaps an auxiliary ensures that Scotland Yard focuses on the wrong person, thereby safeguarding the true identity. Note also that the engravings on the pins differ slightly from the mask signatures. The craftsman is not the same. Grimshaw is merely a convenient decoy. Lestrade, arriving mid-morning, seemed pleased by this apparent breakthrough. Holmes. We have him now. Grimshaw tried to dispose of these pins. He's clearly our culprit. What do you say?" Holmes remained thoughtful. "Inspector, it is a temptation to leap to conclusions. Yet we must resist. Observe the inconsistencies, timing, craftsmanship, and motive. Grimshaw may have sought to profit from proximity to the masks, but he is unlikely to be their creator." As the day wore on, Holmes and I conducted further inquiries around the neighborhood, noting the positions of street lamps, alleyways, and the distribution of foot traffic in relation to the Ventham household. Holmes' method was meticulous. He paused frequently to examine minor details. A scuffed lamppost, the angle of a wrought iron gate, the faint imprint of a boot on a muddy doorstep. Each observation, he assured me, contributed to the larger pattern, though the adversary's intentions remained shrouded. By late afternoon, a curious development occurred. We received an anonymous note slipped beneath the door of Baker Street. It was written in the same delicate hand as the previous message left in the Ventham drawing room. Truth is often hidden in the obvious, yet revealed in the subtle. Seek where shadows meet. Holmes examined it carefully. "Watson, the hand is deliberate, precise. The writer wishes to engage, to provoke thought. Note the phrasing. It implies knowledge of our investigation, perhaps observation of Baker Street itself. The adversary is clever, audacious, and bold enough to address us directly." I shivered at the audacity. "Holmes, surely this is dangerous. To taunt us directly, does it not invite retaliation, perhaps?" He replied, "But it also confirms intelligence and patience. The adversary is testing us, gauging our reactions, and providing insight for the next step. Observe also the words, 'where shadows meet.' It is a clue, Watson, though subtle. It is the first direct message we have received. Everything else was indirect: the masks, the break-in. This is deliberate communication. We spent the remainder of the day considering the significance of the note, attempting to identify potential locations referenced by where shadows meet. Several possibilities presented themselves. The narrow alleys near the Ventham residence, the darkened courtyard of the Opera House, and a small, nearly forgotten passageway between two commercial buildings in Bloomsbury. Each warranted careful scrutiny, yet none offered immediate clarity. Holmes, however, seemed to take satisfaction from the ambiguity. Misdirection is the key, Watson. Our adversary wishes us to chase false leads. Grimshaw is a convenient decoy. The anonymous note guides us subtly. Yet we must not be misled by the obvious interpretation. Observe and analyze without haste, and the truth will reveal itself in due course. As night fell, a sense of foreboding hung over London. The fog had thickened once more, curling into the streets, seeping beneath doorways, and blurring the gaslight's glow. I felt the tension keenly, as though the city itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the next act in this intricate drama. Holmes, meanwhile, appeared untroubled, his mind clearly racing ahead of the immediate events. "Tomorrow," he said softly, almost to himself, "we shall set our track, Watson. But until then, observation, patience, and meticulous consideration are our allies. Our adversary is cunning, yet he or she is not infallible. There will be mistakes, and we must be ready to exploit them." I felt a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Holmes' confidence was unwavering, yet I could sense the peril lurking in the shadows, the invisible hand orchestrating a drama of fear and precision. The masks, the breaking, the false leads all pointed toward a mind both brilliant and dangerous. And I understood, with a quiet dread, that the next phase of the mystery would bring further misdirection, deeper threats, and a challenge to our perceptions that would test every skill Holmes had ever cultivated. Holmes' plan **** the morning that followed the delivery of the anonymous note was bleak even by London's customary standards. The fog hung low over the streets, suffusing the city with a gray pall that seemed to weigh upon the spirit as much as the body. Holmes was already awake when I joined him for breakfast, pacing the sitting room with restless energy. His long coat flared slightly with each turn, his eyes scanning the room as though each object were a piece of a puzzle only he could see. "Watson," he said abruptly, setting down a cup of tea untouched, "the time has come to act. Observation alone will no longer suffice. The intruder is clever and bold, but even the most meticulous mind has its limitations. We shall test him or her directly." I stirred the tea in my cup uneasily. "Holmes, are you suggesting we set a trap?" "Precisely," he replied. "Yet not a trap of brute force or confrontation. That would be folly. No, our plan must be psychological, strategic, and subtle. We shall employ the art of anticipation, using the very fear the intruder cultivates as a tool against them." We departed Baker Street shortly thereafter, cloaked against the persistent drizzle and fog, and made our way to the Ventham residence. Mrs. Ventham greeted us with the pallor of someone whose nights had been restless, yet she seemed willing to cooperate fully with Holmes' plan. He instructed her to maintain her usual routine, but to make small, deliberate changes in behavior, lighting certain lamps at irregular intervals, leaving specific windows ajar, and walking in the garden at particular times. Each action was intended to provide predictable stimuli, creating opportunities for observation and to provoke a reaction from the intruder. "Mrs. Ventham," Holmes said gently, "do not fear these adjustments. They are subtle and will not compromise your safety. Think of them as minor disturbances, probes, if you will, to encourage the intruder to reveal patterns." She nodded with trembling resolve. "I will do as you advise, Mr. Holmes." Holmes then turned to me, eyes sharp and calculating. "Watson, I shall require your assistance in executing the second element of our plan. You are to patrol the streets near the house in discrete intervals, observing the approaches to the property without attracting attention. The intruder is intelligent and cautious, and our success depends on detecting even the faintest deviation from their normal routine." I nodded, my own nerves taut with anticipation. "And you, Holmes?" "I shall remain inside, monitoring and recording, ready to intervene should the need arise," he replied. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that left no doubt he had already calculated the sequence of possible outcomes. The first few hours passed in anxious watchfulness. Holmes scrutinized the faint marks left by the prior intrusions, noting every scuff on the rug, every scratch on the garden wall, and every disturbance of dust and soil. He seemed almost to commune with these silent witnesses, his mind tracing patterns invisible to ordinary observation. By mid-afternoon, our vigilance bore fruit. I noticed a shadow flitting along the edge of the Ventham garden wall, a figure slender and precise, moving with deliberate caution, yet pausing briefly in each position as if calculating its next step. I signaled to Holmes with the agreed-upon gesture, and he moved toward the window, his sharp eyes tracing the subtle movements of our unseen visitor. Holmes whispered, "Patience, Watson. We are not to confront directly. Observe, record, and prepare to anticipate." The intruder continued along the perimeter of the property, pausing at the positions where the masks had previously been placed. Holmes' attention to detail was extraordinary. He noticed the slight deviation in the intruder's step, the left heel, striking the cobblestones with greater pressure, consistent with the imbalance noted in the first mask delivery. And then, a subtle hesitation, as if the intruder were consulting some mental measure before proceeding. "Watson," Holmes murmured. "Note the asymmetry of their stride in the calculated pauses. The intruder is aware of our observation. This is deliberate. They seek to test, to gauge our vigilance. Yet we can use this to our advantage." We followed the intruder's progress in silence, moving carefully through the fog to avoid detection. Finally, the figure paused near the garden gate, reaching for a small object concealed beneath a cloak. Holmes motioned for me to remain still. He crept closer, his approach almost silent, and then the intruder, evidently sensing something amiss, pivoted sharply and disappeared into the dense fog with astonishing speed, leaving behind the object. A small, silver token engraved with the same subtle asymmetry as the masks. Holmes picked it up carefully, examining the engraving with a magnifying lens. "Ah," he murmured, "a most revealing mistake. Our adversary is clever, but even they are not immune to oversight. Observe the engraving. This is the work of the same hand that crafted the masks, yet there is a slight deviation, a lapse in the usual precision. The token was dropped in haste, revealing that the intruder is meticulous but not infallible." I could not suppress a quiet exclamation. "Holmes, this could be the break we needed." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Watson. The token confirms what I suspected. The intruder is someone intimate with the household, familiar with silvercraft, and capable of meticulous observation. Yet their lapse here betrays urgency, or perhaps nervousness. We shall exploit this error." He turned toward me, expression now all business. "Watson, we will prepare a controlled scenario to provoke a more decisive action. Mrs. Ventham will maintain her routine, subtly altered as instructed. We shall position ourselves to observe directly, and I shall prepare a ruse in apparent vulnerability that will compel the intruder to act in a manner revealing both identity and intent." The remainder of the day was consumed with preparation. Holmes detailed the positioning of Mrs. Ventham, the timing of the lines, and my movements along the garden perimeter. Every element was calculated with precision, designed to exploit both the psychology and the methods of the intruder. As night fell, the fog thickened once more, reducing the city to a labyrinth of shadowed streets and gaslit alleys. Holmes and I assumed our positions. I patrolled silently along the perimeter, observing each movement with careful attention, while Holmes, inside, remained vigilant, ready to record every nuance. Hours passed with no apparent activity. Then, as the clock struck 11, a shadow moved again, a slender figure approaching the property, cautious and deliberate, yet faltering ever so slightly as it neared the garden gate. Holmes whispered, "Now, Watson. Observe closely." I strained my eyes through the fog, and the intruder, perceiving an apparent opening, stepped forward to investigate a window left intentionally ajar. It was a subtle, calculated move, exactly as Holmes had anticipated. Holmes' lips curved into a faint, satisfied smile. "Patience, Watson. The trap is closing. The next few moments will reveal everything we require: the hand, the mind, and the intent." And in that tension-soaked instant, I realized that we were standing on the cusp of revelation, that the intruder's meticulous planning and deliberate misdirection were about to meet the precise counter-strategy of Sherlock Holmes. The final act of observation, patience, and calculated provocation had begun. The reveal ***, the night had descended over London in a manner most befitting the unfolding of a great drama. Fog thick as velvet, gas lamps casting uncertain halos across the wet cobblestones, and the occasional clatter of a distant hansom cab. Within the Ventham residence, Holmes had orchestrated the culmination of his plan with the precision of a master conductor. Every lamp, every window, every shadow was accounted for, leaving nothing to chance. I had taken my position along the garden perimeter as instructed, my senses straining to catch even the faintest motion, while Holmes remained poised inside, unseen and undetected. It was past midnight when the intruder emerged from the fog, cautious, deliberate, and methodical. The figure approached the garden wall, noting, it seemed, the deliberate placement of lamps and open windows. The intruder paused, almost imperceptibly, before proceeding, and it was in that brief hesitation that Holmes' trap would spring. Holmes, standing quietly within the drawing room, had arranged the furniture, the lighting, and the placement of Mrs. Ventham with such meticulous care that the intruder, upon entering, could not fail to act in a predictable manner. The intruder's eyes fell upon the window left ajar, the apparent vulnerability, the invitation we had anticipated. Without hesitation, the figure reached for it, intent upon entry. "Now, Watson," Holmes whispered, his eyes gleaming, "observe every detail. The character, the hand, the intended shall all be revealed in this movement." As the intruder attempted to lift themselves through the window, Holmes triggered a subtle mechanism. A small, hidden bell, connected to a cord beneath the sill, which sounded a soft but unmistakable chime. The intruder froze, and in that instant, Holmes, stepping silently, emerged from the shadows with a single commanding gesture. "Enough," he said, his voice both calm and imperious. "I believe the game has run its course." The intruder, startled, whirled, and I saw with astonishment that the figure was not male, as we had assumed from the footprints, but a woman. She was slender, her posture both elegant and precise, with eyes wide in alarm and a hand poised defensively over a small bag she carried. It was clear she had expected confrontation, yet she had not anticipated it would be so swift, so controlled. Holmes stepped forward, unhurried, his gaze fixed upon her. "Madam, your careful planning, your precise movements, and your subtle misdirection have all been noted. The masks, the break-ins, the cryptic notes, all were intended to test, to intimidate, and to manipulate. Yet even the most meticulous design contains error. You have left a trail, as delicate as the engraving on your masks, that has led us to this point." The woman's lips trembled. "Holmes, how did you?" Holmes' eyes sparkled with a mixture of satisfaction and sardonic amusement. "Your methods were intricate, your knowledge of silver work impressive, and your familiarity with the household undeniable. Yet you left a subtle imperfection, the faint asymmetry in the engraving on the token, the variation in the pressure of your steps, the manner in which the masks were positioned relative to the garden wall. Each clue, individually, might have been dismissed, but taken together they reveal your hand unmistakably." I stepped forward, still reeling. "But the motives, Holmes? Why terrorize the Venthams with such precise and elaborate measures?" Holmes gestured toward the woman, who had now lowered her hands slightly, her defiance mingling with resignation. "Madam," he said, "you are no common criminal. Your actions are driven by both skill and a complex motive, vengeance tempered by the desire to demonstrate control. You hold grievances small, perhaps, yet significant against the household. Your masks were both warning and statement, a demonstration of your artistry, precision, and patience. You sought to instill fear, and in that fear, measure the responses of those involved, including us." She glanced toward the garden, then back at Holmes. "You knew lie. I only wanted them to understand, to know that I could reach them, that I had power." Holmes nodded, acknowledging her candor, yet his expression remained firm. "And yet you underestimated observation, patience, and deduction. The sequence of your actions, the psychological probes, the apparent misdirection, all of it has been noted, analyzed, and countered. It is precisely because of your meticulousness that we were able to predict your movements and set this trap. I could not suppress a question that had been gnawing at me. Holmes, the first suspect, Grimshaw, did you ever suspect him at all?" Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Grimshaw was merely a convenient decoy, Watson. A man of skill, certainly, but not the architect of these disturbances. He possesses no motive, only proximity and skill, and our adversary was counting upon those facts to mislead Scotland Yard and divert attention. The first suspect is often a useful tool in testing the perception of those pursuing the true culprit." The woman's expression shifted, a mixture of fear and awe. You knew?" Holmes inclined his head. "I knew the patterns, the inconsistencies, and the subtleties of your craft. The hidden clue, the asymmetry in the mask engraving was the first step. Your subsequent movements, calculated yet revealing, confirmed the identity. Observation, deduction, and patience, these are the tools that uncover truth where artifice and intimidation have failed. She sank into a chair, trembling, the gravity of her predicament finally settling upon her. I did not think anyone would see through it. Holmes' eyes softened, though his voice remained firm. Few would, madam. But it is the nature of intellect to seek the underlying order, the subtle truth. You have skill, intelligence, and artistry, but you applied them to misdirection and intimidation rather than lawful enterprise. That choice has led you here. I observed her closely, noting the tension in her shoulders, the slight rise and fall of her chest, the trembling fingers clutching the small bag. She was neither hardened criminal nor common thief, rather. She was an artist and a strategist, blinded by her desire for control and acknowledgement. Holmes stepped aside, allowing me to approach and speak gently. It is finished, I said. The masks, the notes, the intrusions all revealed. There is no need for further fear. The woman lifted her eyes to mine, tears glistening.
I suppose not.
And yet, what will become of me? Holmes regarded her with a philosopher's gaze. The law will take its course, madam. But reflect upon this. Intelligence, skill, and precision are gifts. Applied to malice, they bring danger. Applied to good, they bring power of a different sort, the ability to create rather than destroy. I felt a deep sense of closure, though the tension that had gripped us for days still lingered in the air. Holmes turned to me, expression quiet, almost reflective. Watson, it is in such cases that one appreciates the subtle interplay of intellect, psychology, and method. Our adversary was clever, patient, and daring, yet the smallest error token, a step, a subtle asymmetry proved decisive. As always, the hidden details reveal the truth when observed with care and reason. The woman, now subdued, was taken into custody with all due propriety. Lestrade, arriving shortly thereafter, expressed both relief and astonishment at the swiftness and thoroughness of Holmes' resolution. As I left the Ventham residence that night, walking beside Holmes through the damp, foggy streets of London, I felt the familiar mixture of admiration and awe. Another case had concluded, the threads of deception unraveled, the subtle clues woven into an intricate tapestry of deduction laid bare. And once again, I had borne witness to the extraordinary mind of Sherlock Holmes, whose insight, patience, double-A, malleance rendered the most baffling of mysteries transparent to reason. Holmes remained silent beside me, his gaze fixed on some distant, imperceptible pattern in the fog. I sensed, as I always did, that though one case had ended, the city itself contained countless other puzzles, each awaiting the keen eye, the patient mind, and the unerring deduction of Sherlock Holmes. Aftermath and reflections ***, the fog that had clung so persistently to London for the past week seemed, at last, to have lifted, leaving the city bathed in the faint gray light of early morning. The streets were damp, yet quiet, and the familiar clatter of hansom cabs and shopkeepers' calls felt less oppressive than during the height of the crisis. The city, it seemed, had breathed again, though the echoes of the terror we had witnessed still lingered in memory. At Baker Street, Holmes moved with his customary precision, yet there was a distinct calm about him, a composure that contrasted sharply with the turbulence of the past days. He had spent much of the night documenting the events of the previous evening, methodically recording the sequence of movements, the details of the intruder's behavior, and the critical insights gleaned from the final trap. I observed him, as always, with a mixture of admiration and awe, knowing that even after the resolution of the case, his mind remained active, restless, and ceaselessly analytical. "Watson," he said suddenly, without lifting his eyes from his notes, "the case, while now concluded, offers lessons far beyond the immediate events. Observe, for instance, the manner in which misdirection was employed. The decoy, the anonymous notes, the subtle psychological provocations. It is an exercise in both intellect and patience, a reminder that human behavior can be as intricate and precise as any mechanical device." I nodded, reflecting on the events of the past week. Grimshaw, the jeweler, had been cleared of suspicion, yet I remembered the certainty with which even seasoned police officers had initially seized upon him as the culprit. How easily appearances could deceive, I thought. How vulnerable the mind is to the seductive allure of the obvious. "Holmes," I ventured, "and the woman herself, the intruder, I mean, do you not feel any pity, or even admiration in a way, for her skill, her intelligence, her daring?" Holmes looked up, his expression momentarily softened. Pity, perhaps, Watson. Admiration, cautiously. She is clever, indeed, and she applied her faculties with great skill. Yet her intent was destructive, manipulative, and, in a sense, morally compromised. Intelligence, when divorced from principle, can become a dangerous instrument. One may admire the craftsmanship, but one must also acknowledge the consequences of its misuse. I understood, though my heart was still heavy with the memory of her fear and vulnerability when confronted. And the Venthams? I asked. They are safe now, but they have suffered greatly. The psychological impact, I fear, will linger far longer than the masks and intrusions themselves. Holmes' gaze drifted toward the window, the morning fog dissolving into a pale, diffused light. Indeed, Watson. Fear leaves traces in the mind as indelibly as scratches upon wood or footprints upon soil. Yet they are unharmed, and the pattern of intrusion has been broken. Safety, though fragile, has been restored. That is the most one can hope for in matters such as these. A letter arrived from Mrs. Ventham later that morning, expressing profound gratitude for Holmes' intervention. She described her relief, the sense of closure afforded by the apprehension of the intruder, and her astonishment at Holmes' methodical brilliance. I read the letter aloud, and even in her words, the lingering shadows of fear were evident, tempered only by the reassurance provided by our vigilance. Holmes, as I expected, analyzed every phrase. "Observe, Watson," he said, "how language itself can convey residual anxiety. Note her choice of words, her emphasis upon vigilance, and the repeated references to control. Even in relief, the mind registers the trauma experienced." I sat quietly, reflecting upon the layers of the case, the masks, the misdirection, the psychological probing, the hidden clue that had ultimately led to the intruder's exposure. Holmes had seen what I could not. The subtleties of craftsmanship, the asymmetries of movement, the psychology embedded within each act. And yet, the resolution had also revealed something more profound, the interplay of morality, intellect, and human frailty. As we resumed our usual routine in Baker Street, Holmes attended to his chemistry experiments with absent-minded precision, while I chronicled the case in careful detail. The narrative of the silver mask, the strategic maneuvers, the psychological probes, and the final reveal all demanded recording not merely for posterity, but as an exercise in understanding the mind at work, both our adversaries and Holmes. "Watson," Holmes said after a time, "consider the nature of patience in our line of work. Observation is not a passive act. It is active, deliberate, and requires a restraint that is rarely natural. Most men leap to action at the first sign of disorder, yet intellect properly exercised waits. Measures, tests, and even apparent inaction are all instruments of discovery. The intruder, brilliant though she was, ultimately revealed herself not through boldness, but through subtle error, deviation from perfect symmetry in her craft." I reflected upon this, marveling at Holmes' ability to transform what appeared to be random acts of malevolence into a coherent tapestry of deduction. "It is extraordinary, Holmes," I said, "how you perceive the imperceptible, discern the patterns invisible to others, and then craft a response so precise that the outcome becomes inevitable." Holmes allowed a faint smile. "Extraordinary perhaps, Watson, but not miraculous. Observation, patience, and reasoning, these are the tools. The rest is practice and care. One does not leap to conclusions. One guides events with subtlety, exploiting the adversary's own methods against them." The day passed in quiet reflection. London itself seemed to breathe more freely, the fog lifting as though relieved that the tension had passed. I ventured out briefly to purchase provisions, noting with satisfaction the ordinary life of the city continuing unabated, children running along wet pavements, street vendors calling their wares, and the occasional cab navigating the shiny, damp cobbles. Yet beneath the veneer of normality, I could not help but recall the precision, calculation, and audacity of the intruder's movements, a reminder that danger often lurks behind the most unremarkable facades. That evening, as we sat by the fire in Baker Street, Holmes contemplated the flickering flames, hands steepled in repose. "Watson," he said softly, "the resolution of this case reminds us that intellect, when allied with principle, produces clarity. Intellect divorced from morality, however, becomes a dangerous force. The intruder possessed skill, patience, and artistry, but the lack of ethical restraint brought her to ruin. A lesson, if ever there were one, for all who seek to wield power without conscience." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. And yet, Holmes, I cannot help but marvel at the subtlety, the craftsmanship, and the brilliance of the plan itself. Even in misdeed, the artistry is remarkable. Holmes allowed a faint, almost imperceptible chuckle. Remarkable indeed, Watson. And it is our task to unravel such complexity, to ensure that skill serves justice rather than terror. Another case concluded, another mind brought to light. And now we rest content that order has been restored, at least for the present. I leaned back, reflecting on the events of the past fortnight. The masks, the misdirection, the hidden clues, and the final reveal had all unfolded in a manner befitting the most intricate of mysteries. Holmes, as always, had guided the outcome with intellect and patience, leaving me both humbled and inspired. London, for its part, continued unabated fog and gaslight, clatter and murmur. Commerce and quiet domesticity, yet the city had once again been protected by the singular brilliance of Sherlock Holmes. And I, ever the chronicler, felt both privilege and duty to record these events faithfully, that others might glimpse the extraordinary mind at work behind the ordinary facade of Victorian life. Thus concluded the tale of the Silver Mask, a mystery of craft, misdirection, and intellect, whose resolution affirmed enduring value of observation, deduction, and the unerring application of reason to even the most perplexing of human intrigues. Echoes and reflections ****, the days that followed the apprehension of the intruder passed in a rhythm of quiet routine, yet I found myself acutely aware of the subtle traces the case had left upon both the city and our own spirits. London, ever indifferent, continued its bustling existence beneath the mist and smoke of industry. The gas lamps flickered faithfully, the hansom cabs rattled over cobblestones, and the occasional clip-clop of distant hooves reminded one that life was uninterrupted. Yet within the walls of Baker Street, a more reflective atmosphere prevailed. Holmes, true to form, devoted himself to his chemical experiments and the occasional violin, while I endeavored to record, in meticulous detail, the events of the Silver Mask case. "Watson," Holmes remarked one morning, as I chronicled the sequence of letters, masks, and intrusions, "it is important to note that even after apprehension, cases such as these leave echoes. The mind that orchestrates misdirection does not vanish entirely with arrest. The psychological aftershocks persist. Observe the Venthams. They will require patience, reassurance, and an understanding that the past week's terror, while concluded, has left an imprint upon their perception of safety." I nodded, reflecting upon the lingering tension I had witnessed in their manner and speech. Even as the threat was removed, fear leaves subtle, lasting impressions, much as a hand might press upon soft clay, leaving a mark that is visible long after the hand has been lifted. Holmes, in his customary manner, did not dwell upon sentimentality, yet I noted the small gestures, his inquiry after Mrs. Ventham's welfare, the discreet attention to her husband's anxiety, the careful consideration of their household staff. In each instance, the man who seemed coldly logical exhibited an underlying humanity, though one carefully tempered by reason. "Do you ever wonder, Holmes?" I asked one afternoon, as we walked along the fog-laden streets toward the local chemist, "what drives a mind to such elaborate misdirection, to craft masks, notes, and psychological tests with such precision?" Holmes considered this silently, his gaze following the curve of a distant alley. Curiosity, Watson, is often a double-edged sword. Intellect seeks patterns, connections, and results. When untethered from morality, or when influenced by resentment or a desire for control, it can become dangerous. The mind of our intruder was both brilliant and flawed, a combination that produced fear rather than understanding. Yet, even in such misapplication, one observes remarkable skill. I shivered slightly, recalling the slender, precise figure who had tested us so relentlessly. And the lessons we have learned. How do we ensure that such a mind, if released, does not again imperil others? Holmes' expression hardened slightly. "The law provides for containment, Watson. Beyond that, it is the duty of the vigilant to recognize potential in others and to guide, where possible, the application of intellect toward beneficial ends. Observation and patience are not solely tools of detection. They are also instruments of foresight." Our walks often included visits to the Ventham household in the days following the resolution of the case. The family, though still somewhat shaken, displayed a remarkable resilience. Holmes' presence alone, measured and calm, seemed to restore their equilibrium. I observed the subtle ways in which fear had altered perception. Mrs. Ventham lingered near doorways, her eyes scanning shadows with heightened alertness. Mr. Ventham noted every movement in the garden with careful scrutiny. Yet, gradually, the normal rhythms of life resumed, aided in no small part by Holmes' quiet guidance and reassurance. One afternoon, Holmes paused in the garden and gestured toward a small cluster of plants near the wall where the intruder had made her final approach. "Watson, note how even the smallest environmental details can influence human behavior. The slope of the soil, the placement of shadows, the visibility of pathways, each factor contributes to decision-making." The intruder observed these details, exploited them, yet even so, a subtle lapse betrayed her. And therein lies the enduring lesson. Perfection is rare, even in the most meticulous mind. I reflected upon this, recalling the silver token, the asymmetrical engraving, and the careful yet imperfect movements that had led to the intruder's exposure. It was astonishing to consider how minute details easily overlooked could unravel an entire web of deception. Holmes, sensing my thoughts, added quietly, "Observation, Watson, is the cornerstone of intellect applied with purpose. It is the careful scrutiny of the seemingly trivial that yields clarity. The human mind, for all its complexity, leaves traces, subtle markers of intent, patterns, and error. Recognizing them is our task." That evening we returned to Baker Street, and I settled before the fire with my writing materials. Holmes resumed his experiments, occasionally humming a low, thoughtful tune. I paused to consider the totality of the Silver Mask case. It had been, in many ways, a study of human psychology as much as of criminal method. The masks themselves were symbolic emblems of concealment, artistry, and intimidation. The notes, the intrusions, the misdirection, they were tests of perception, patience, and reasoning. And yet, above all, the case reaffirmed the unerring importance of intellect guided by principle. Holmes had demonstrated, once again, that careful observation, logical deduction, and psychological understanding could resolve threats that even seasoned police officers could not fathom. It was, in every sense, a testament to the singular brilliance of the man beside me. As I reflected, Holmes suddenly spoke, breaking the silence. "Watson, it is in cases such as these that one appreciates both the fragility and the resilience of the human mind. Fear, when skillfully manipulated, can cloud judgment, yet reason, when applied with diligence, restores clarity. The intruder possessed skill, but it was skill untethered from moral constraint. Our role is to observe, to guide, and, when necessary, to intervene." I nodded, feeling both satisfaction and awe. The city outside, still cloaked in intermittent fog, seemed less menacing in that moment, as though London itself recognized the equilibrium restored by intellect applied with wisdom. Finally, Holmes rose from his seat and stretched, his expression unusually contemplative. "Watson," he said softly, "another case concluded. Yet countless others await, hidden within the folds of this city, puzzles, intrigues, and misdirections waiting for attention. We shall rest, recover, and prepare. And when the next enigma arrives, we shall meet it as always with observation, deduction, and patience." I closed my notebook, the firelight casting shadows upon the walls, and felt the familiar mixture of admiration, gratitude, and anticipation. Another case had ended, another mind unraveled, and another story chronicled for the record. Yet I knew, as always, that London contained innumerable mysteries, each awaiting the extraordinary intellect of Sherlock Holmes. And as the fog pressed gently against the windows of Baker Street, I understood, once more, that even in resolution, the echoes of mystery remain, subtle yet persistent, reminding us that the pursuit of truth, however elusive, is both noble and unending. Epilogue. The calm after the storm ****, the days following the conclusion of the Silver Mask case passed with an almost deceptive calm over London. The gas lamps glimmered through the morning mist as usual, and the streets, though still damp from occasional drizzle, resumed their ordinary rhythm. Children scurried along the pavements, merchants' voices mingled with the rattle of cab wheels, and the distant hum of factory work reminded one that the life of the city went on, indifferent to the dramas unfolding behind closed doors. At Baker Street, the atmosphere was quieter, tempered by the weight of reflection. Holmes had returned to his studies and experiments, his meticulous mind now occupied with chemical curiosities and the peculiarities of certain plant extracts, while I dedicated my hours to chronicling the final stages of our intricate investigation. Yet even amidst the routine, the tension and excitement of the case lingered like a faint perfume, a reminder of the subtle, perilous games played in shadowed corridors. Holmes, who often appeared distant in his reverie, suddenly addressed me one morning as I adjusted my ink and paper by the window. "Watson, the events of the past fortnight underscore a truth I have observed time and again. Intellect, when allied to ethical purpose, produces clarity and resolution. When divorced from conscience, however, it becomes a dangerous instrument. The woman behind the silver masks possessed skill, patience, and artistry, but without moral restraint. Those gifts were converted into instruments of fear and manipulation. I nodded in agreement, reflecting upon her daring and the audacity of her designs. And yet, Holmes, one cannot help but admire the precision, the cleverness, even if her intent was misguided. Holmes' expression softened momentarily. Admiration is not condemnation, Watson. One may recognize skill without condoning its application. In all things, one must observe clearly, judge impartially, and act decisively. In this case, her errors, minute though they were, proved fatal to her scheme. Even the most meticulous mind is susceptible to human fallibility. The Venthams themselves were recovering steadily, their courage restored in large part by Holmes' intervention. Mrs. Ventham expressed her gratitude with warmth tempered by lingering unease, her eyes still flicking occasionally to shadows that once held menace. Mr. Ventham, too, displayed the cautious attentiveness of a man who had felt fear intrude upon his domestic peace. Yet both recognized, in their own ways, the assurance brought by Holmes' intellect and unwavering observation. One afternoon, Holmes and I visited them to ensure the household had returned to equilibrium. The air of tension had lessened, though subtle gestures, Mrs. Ventham's careful checking of locks, Mr. Ventham's scrutiny of garden path still betrayed remnants of the fear that had gripped them. Holmes observed these details with quiet interest, noting in his usual fashion how fear imprints itself subtly upon behavior. "Notice, Watson," he whispered as we observed from the drawing room, "how perception adjusts to past trauma. The mind retains memory of danger even when the threat is removed. Our task, when possible, is to restore confidence alongside safety." As I watched, I felt a profound admiration not only for Holmes' methodical brilliance, but also for his understanding of human psychology. He applied intellect not merely to solve puzzles, but to restore balance, to guide those affected by crime back to a semblance of normality. Holmes, noticing my contemplation, added quietly, "It is in the aftermath of these cases that one truly appreciates the value of observation, deduction, and patience. The crime itself is only part of the narrative. The human impact, the psychological traces, and the moral lessons form the larger story. Observe closely, Watson, and one learns far more than any single act of mischief or malice could convey." That evening, as we returned to Baker Street, a quiet satisfaction settled upon us both. The case of the Silver Mask had concluded not with a flourish of violence or dramatic confrontation, but with patient observation, subtle provocation, and the precise application of reason. The intruder had been revealed through minute asymmetries, missteps, and inconsistencies that only a mind trained in the exacting discipline of deduction could detect. Holmes resumed his position by the fire, hands steepled, eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Watson," he said after a moment of silence, "it is cases such as these that remind one of the delicate balance between intellect and morality, observation and inference, fear and rationality. The tools we possess the power to see what others overlook are formidable, yet they demand careful, ethical application." I could not help but feel a swelling admiration as I chronicled these thoughts. "Holmes," I said softly, "you have once again demonstrated that intellect, guided by principle, can restore order where chaos once reigned. The silver mask, the misdirection, the psychological probes all have been unraveled through nothing more than reason and patience." Holmes inclined his head, a faint smile playing upon his lips. "It is a discipline, Watson, a careful exercise of mind, perception, and timing. Danger tests intellect, misdirection tests patience, and error, however slight, provides opportunity. In this, the most dangerous criminals reveal themselves to those who observe attentively." I leaned back, reflecting upon the case, the intruder's skill, the intricate web of deception, and the eventual triumph of deduction. The silver mask, now a symbol of both fear and artistry, had been rendered powerless, its creator unmasked, and the household restored to peace. And yet, the case left an indelible impression that the subtlety of human action, the minutiae of movement, and the imperceptible errors often conceal or reveal truth in equal measure. Holmes, as though sensing my thoughts, glanced up. "Watson, London is a city of puzzles and enigmas. One case may conclude, yet another awaits, hidden in shadows, in words, or in gestures unnoticed by most. Our task is unending, yet infinitely rewarding. Observation, deduction, and reason are tools of justice and understanding." The Silver Mask is but one example, countless others lie waiting. I felt a mixture of awe and anticipation, knowing that the city we inhabited held endless mysteries for Holmes to unravel. And when the next case arises, I asked half rhetorically. Holmes' gaze, fixed upon the fire, was steady and certain. We shall meet it as always, Watson, with observation, deduction, and patience. Nothing escapes the attentive mind. The firelight danced across his features, highlighting the intensity and serenity coexisting within him. I realized, with the familiar mixture of admiration and humility, that I would never fully comprehend the breadth of his intellect. Yet I also knew that, as long as I stood beside him, I would witness the unraveling of London's enigmas and the quiet triumph of reason over deception. And so, the case of the Silver Mask came to a close, its mysteries resolved, its adversary revealed, and its lessons preserved. London, for all its fog and shadow, returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet beneath the surface, I knew that countless puzzles remained, awaiting the keen eye, the sharp mind, and the unwavering deduction of Sherlock Holmes. As the evening shadows lengthened, and the last traces of fog drifted from the streets, I set down my pen, feeling a profound sense of completion. Another case chronicled, another mind unmasked, and yet another affirmation of the enduring power of intellect, patience, and moral discernment. Holmes, seated beside me, gave no outward sign of triumph, yet the quiet satisfaction in his posture spoke volumes. And I, forever loyal and admiring, recognized once more that I was witness to a mind unparalleled, a detective whose brilliance would illuminate the darkest mysteries of London, for as long as the city needed him.